Ever since Zelda Breath of the Wild was announced, we have all been hooked by it, and most people would even say that the game is their reason for buying a Switch. It was legendary, and there was one thing that helped a lot with this: the enemies. And today, I will tell you why. We've seen them everywhere, lurking in plain sight camouflaged, running around on the fields of Hyrule, or patrolling the outer walls of the castle. The enemies are everywhere in the world, and a ton of classics return like choo-choos and bokoblins. But this time, it has all changed. They are completely different compared to the previous games. If we look at older titles like A Link Between Worlds and Skyward Sword, for example, then you can quite easily summarize enemies. A bokoblin, for example, had some small gimmicks here and there, but mostly fought with a single melee weapon, tried to block your strikes, and attacked with quite linear moves. Something else like a choo-choo in A Link Between Worlds just moves around a bit and are sometimes electric. That's it. A big portion of the enemies in the Legend of Zelda series have a set tactic or way of doing things, so after some time they become extremely predictable and boring, to be honest. You just ignore them after a while. However, all of that changed when Zelda Breath of the Wild finally hit the scene, and we all found out extremely quickly what happened. They are a lot smarter, and maybe even smarter than you. When I was at the Nintendo Switch press event in Sweden, we got a chance to play the game early. Here, Zeltec, Commonwealth Realm, Jihab, and I learned very quickly that the game wasn't as predictable as before. When running around on the Great Plateau and just fighting the bokoblins, we already noticed that they were quite opportunistic. Every opening they could get, they would use, even if it wasn't fitting for their behavior. They did everything to win. Picking up a better weapon on the ground? Yes, please. Fire that could be used to light its weapon and deal extra damage? Will do. Throw an explosive barrel on the player when he isn't paying attention? Yep. They have so many ways to counterattack you and surprise you, and this is only one enemy. Back in the day, they would have a set of moves and reactions, but now their possibilities are limitless. There are a couple of reasons why this is the case, and one of those is that the combat and physics engine in the game are combined. In the video, The Making of The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild open air concept, this was mentioned by developers. This expanded the combat immensely. All of a sudden, the doors were opened for a whole new range of tactics, and also ways for the player to interact with them. For example, Bokoblin is unarmed and tries to throw rocks at you. With your weapon, you can use some sweet baseball tactics to hit him back. The enemy might be smart enough to even damage you when he has no weapon, but you can fight back in a way. Besides that, in the world itself, there are a lot of ways to take on enemies. Pushing down a huge boulder, explosives, lighting your arrow on a campfire, and more. But all of this can be used by the enemies as well, and they certainly will, making every encounter different from the previous. It opens the door to new possibilities for both parties, making the fight a lot more interesting for sure. The developers even said they created a combat system where it's okay if you use this somewhat underhanded way to win. Experimenting is extremely rewarding in the game, and because of all the options, enemies will keep surprising you as well. Now, how the enemies make decisions in this game is also extremely different compared to the previous ones. Alright, this is essentially what happens every fight. The enemy knows what he or she is capable of, and keeps an eye on the surroundings, including the player's behavior. Now they will make decisions based on the scenario, and if it sees an opening because the player turns around, then you might get a barrel to the head, because it saw a chance and knew that there was an object nearby that it could interact with, so it went for that option. This is just one example, but overall it tends to use this logic. And of course it keeps in mind what abilities it can use against you. Using all of this, it reacts differently every time and tries to use the most useful and effective attack against you. Now this makes them feel real instead of predictable robots, and also a lot more difficult compared to their older versions. Besides these combat tactics, they also added something else to make them feel more real: different weapons. In older games, most enemies had one or two weapon types they could possibly carry, but in this game they can have any shape or size of them, from two-handed swords to polearms. This added more variation to them yet again because their attacks, reach, and speed will be different depending on their weapon. This is especially seen in the lynel, because its attacks change drastically when it has different weapons. Something like this can be used to benefit the enemy or player as well. Yet again, you can use opportunities. But this isn't all. Besides these combat variations, there are also other things that they do to feel more real and seem more interesting. If you observe bokoblins, for example, you can see that they do their own thing when they're not attacking you. In a lot of camps, you can see them taking on wild boar so they can take the food that it drops. They do this on their own, so they're not just sitting there doing nothing waiting for the player to come around. Another thing they tend to do when you're not bugging them is attack other NPCs that roam the world. So when you're exploring, you can come across random people battling monsters like bokoblins. This adds to the realism of the enemies yet again, because you aren't the only target. And it also makes for a fun and interesting scenario. All of this combined makes the one scene in Breath of the Wild a lot better than any of the previous. Compared to the last big Zelda game, Skyward Sword, it's a massive jump. They're so much better now, and Nintendo really outdid themselves. The enemies finally think for themselves and can react differently to strange and new situations. All of this makes it a lot more fun, surprising and interactive. And even now, up until this day, the enemies can surprise me and outplay me in a lot of ways. So let's hope that Nintendo keeps making such smart enemies and design them in such a genius way. Thanks for watching, everybody. I hope you enjoyed. If you want to watch more videos, then click those annotations. Do you have any video ideas? Leave them in the comments. Tell me, you lovely. I already have a huge backlog, but more is always better.